He took every account, every asset, every dollar she thought they had built together. But what Daniel Bennett didn't realize as he walked out of that courtroom believing he had won was that there was one thing he had never touched, never tracked, never even remembered existed, and it would become the very thing that unraveled everything he thought he controlled. But on the day it all ended, Laura Bennett didn't feel like she had anything left to fight with, because after 28 years of marriage, the divorce didn't explode in shouting matches or slam doors. It dissolved quietly, strategically, almost surgically, in a way that left no visible damage until she looked closer and realized there was nothing left at all. No shared accounts, no safety net, no house with her name on it, not even the small consulting business she had helped build from their garage in the early years when they could barely afford groceries. Because Daniel had spent the last year preparing for this moment, while she was still believing they were working through a rough patch, moving money in ways she didn't notice, restructuring ownership under legal frameworks she didn't understand, opening accounts she didn't know existed, and closing the ones she thought were theirs. And by the time he finally sat her down at the kitchen table and said in that calm, measured voice she used to trust that he wanted a divorce, the outcome had already been decided long before she even realized they were playing a game. And what made it worse wasn't just a loss. It was the way he presented it. Like he was being fair, like he was being generous, sliding neatly organized folders across the table with tabs and summaries and explanations that made it all sound reasonable, if he didn't look too closely, telling her she would be taken care of while carefully defining exactly what that meant in legal terms that stripped away any claim she might have had to the life they built together. And Laura, exhausted from months of emotional distance, she couldn't explain in arguments that never quite turned into anything she could hold on to, didn't fight the way people later told her she should have, because she didn't yet understand that there was something to fight against. She thought this was just how these things unfolded after long marriages. That maybe this was what compromise looked like at the end of a life chapter. But sitting in that courtroom weeks later, listening to attorneys speak about her life like it was a set of numbers on a spreadsheet, she began to feel something shift, a quiet, creeping realization that every agreement, every document, every clause had been designed to leave her with just enough to walk away without collapsing, but not enough to rebuild anything meaningful. And when the judge finalized the settlement and everything became official, it didn't feel like a dramatic ending. It felt like something had been quietly erased, like she had been edited out of her own life story because the house she thought was theirs had been placed in a trust tied solely to Daniel months earlier. The savings accounts had been drained and redirected into investments under his name. And even the business she had worked on late nights and weekends, the one she thought represented their shared effort and sacrifice, was now legally as a loan due to restructuring she had signed off on without realizing what it meant, trusting him when he said it was just paperwork to simplify things. And as she packed her belongings in the weeks that followed, she started to see how thoroughly he had planned this, how every piece had been moved into place while she was still living inside the illusion of a marriage that was already over. And there was no dramatic confrontation when she left the house for the last time. No moment where he showed doubt or hesitation, just a quiet efficiency as he watched her load her things into the back of a car that felt too small to carry. Nearly 3 decades of life. And she kept expecting to feel something sharper, anger or rage or even clarity. But what settled in instead was a kind of numb disbelief, like she was still waiting for someone to explain how it all made sense, how a partnership that long could be dismantled so cleanly. And in the small rental she moved into on the edge of a town she had never planned to live in, surrounded by boxes she didn't have the energy to unpack, Laura began to understand that what hurt most wasn't just what she had lost. It was how completely she had been outmaneuvered without ever realizing there was a game being played. How the person she trusted most had spent months, maybe longer, quietly ensuring that when the end came, she would have no leverage, no claim, no way to push back. And as days turned into weeks, she replayed moments in her head. Conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt loaded with meaning. Papers she signed without reading closely because she believed in the man sitting across from her. Decisions that felt mutual, but were actually carefully guided in one direction. And each realization landed heavier than the last. Not because it changed anything, What was done, but because it showed her just how deliberate it had all been. How this wasn't a breakdown or a misunderstanding, but a calculated exit designed to leave her standing outside of everything they had built. And meanwhile, Daniel moved forward with a confidence that only comes from believing you have secured every possible advantage, stepping into a new life that looked polished and stable on the surface. While Laura sat in that small, unfamiliar space, trying to figure out where her life had gone, not yet knowing that the story wasn't as finished as it seemed. Not yet realizing that in all his careful planning, in all the accounts he moved and assets he claimed, Daniel had overlooked something small, something buried in the past, something that didn't look like much at first glance, but would eventually become that one piece he couldn't take back, the one thing he never saw coming, and the one mistake that would change everything. What Daniel Bennett never counted on. What he couldn't have counted on was that the one thing Laura hadn't thought about in years would quietly be waiting for her, untouched, unchanged, and completely outside his reach. And it didn't come to her in some dramatic revelation or perfectly timed discovery, but in the middle of an ordinary, frustrating afternoon, when she was sitting on the floor of her small rental, surrounded by half-open boxes and scattered paperwork, trying to make sense of what little remained of her financial life, sorting through old tax returns and insurance documents, and anything else that might help her understand how to rebuild for what felt like nothing. And it was there, buried between outdated records and envelopes she had nearly thrown away, that she found a faded folder with her grandmother's name written across the top in handwriting she hadn't seen in over a decade. And for a moment, she just stared at it, her mind slow to connect the dots, because that part of her life felt so distant now, like something that belonged to a different version of herself, someone younger, someone who still spent summers in a quiet place far away from everything that had come to define her adult life. And when she finally opened it, carefully, almost hesitantly, as if the contents might not even be real anymore, she found the deed, folded but intact, still legally binding, still bearing her name, transferring ownership of a small piece of land her grandmother had, left to her years before. Land she hadn't visited in so long that it barely felt like it belonged to her anymore. And yet there it was, undeniable, untouched by the legal unraveling of her marriage, never mentioned in the divorce, never listed among shared assets, never moved or restructured or hidden behind any of the careful mechanisms Daniel had used to take everything else because he had simply forgotten about it. Or maybe he had never truly known it existed in the first place. And as that realization began to settle in, slow and disorienting at first, Laura felt something she hadn't felt since before the divorce was finalized. Something fragile but unmistakable. A sense that maybe, just maybe, not everything had been taken from her after all. And at first, she didn't let herself get carried away because the idea felt too uncertain, too small to matter in the face of everything she had lost. But the more she looked at the document, the more real it became, and with it came memories she hadn't revisited in years. Long summers spent in northern Montana, the smell of pine trees and lake water, the sound of wind moving through branches at night, mornings that started slow and quiet in a way her adult life never allowed. And at the center of it all, the cabin, small and weathered even back then, but steady, familiar, a place that had never asked anything from her except that she be there. And the thought of it now, after everything she had just been through, felt almost unreal, like remembering a place from a dream. But unlike everything else in her life at that moment, this wasn't something that had been rewritten or taken or negotiated away. It was still hers, entirely hers. And that simple fact began to take root in her mind in a way she couldn't ignore. Because for weeks she had been operating under the assumption that she was starting from nothing, that every piece of her past had been stripped away and there was nothing left to anchor her to anything real. But now there was this one thing, quiet and overlooked but solid in a way nothing else was anymore, and without overthinking it. Maybe because she was afraid that if she waited too long she would talk herself out of it. Laura made the decision to go there, to see it for herself, not as a memory, but as something tangible, something she could stand in again and touch and confirm that it still existed beyond paperwork and faded recollection. And the drive took longer than she remembered, stretching across hours that gave her too much time to think, too much time to replay everything that had happened and everything she still didn't fully understand. But as the landscape began to change, as familiar shapes and distant landmarks started to emerge, Something inside her shifted as well. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that by the time she turned onto the narrow road that led toward the property, she felt a kind of quiet steadiness she hadn't felt in months. And when the cabin finally came into view, standing exactly where it always had, framed by trees that seemed both unchanged and older at the same time, she had to stop the car for a moment just to take it in. Because there was something almost surreal about seeing it there, untouched by everything that had happened in her life. As if it existed outside of time, outside of loss, outside of everything Daniel had tried to control and reshape. And when she stepped inside, expecting at least some level of decay or damage, she found instead that while it was dusty and worn, it was still standing strong. The furniture still in place, the structure still solid, the silence inside it not empty, but calm. And for the first time since the divorce, Laura felt something settle in her chest that wasn't grief or confusion or exhaustion, but something quieter, something steadier. The realization that this place, forgotten as it had been, was now the one part of her life that hadn't been touched by any of it. And as she moved through the rooms, opening windows, letting in light, brushing away dust, she began to understand that this wasn't just a leftover piece of the past. It was something else entirely, something that hadn't been claimed or diminished or redefined by anyone else, something that still belonged to her without conditions or negotiations. And that night, as she sat on the old porch wrapped in a blanket, she found tucked away in a closet, listening to the same quiet sound she remembered from years ago, she realized that for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what was still possible. And that shift, small as it seemed in that moment, was the beginning of something Daniel had never planned for. Because in all the careful steps he had taken to secure every asset, every account, every advantage, he had overlooked the one thing that didn't fit into his system, the one piece of her life that had never been part of his control. And as Laura sat there in the stillness of that place, she began to see it not just as a refuge, but as a foundation, something she could build from, something that was entirely hers in a way nothing else had been for a very long time. And for the first time since the day he told her marriage was over, she allowed herself to believe that maybe the story wasn't finished yet, that maybe what looked like an ending had simply been a turning point, and that the one thing he forgot might turn out to be the only thing that mattered. What Daniel Bennett never understood, never even considered, was that control only works when you account for everything. And the moment you miss even one piece, no matter how small it seems, that's where everything begins to slip. And by the time Laura realized what the cabin truly represented, it was no longer just a quiet escape from the life she had lost. It had become something far more important, something steady and undeniable, something that gave her back a sense of direction she hadn't felt in years. Because in the weeks after she arrived, what started as simple cleaning and small repairs slowly turned into something more intentional, more focused, as if each task, fixing a broken hinge, clearing out old debris, restoring the worn wooden floors, wasn't just about the cabin itself, but about reclaiming something inside her that had been buried under months of confusion and loss. And the more time she spent there, the more she began to see possibilities where she hadn't seen anything before, not in a sudden, unrealistic way, but gradually through conversations with people in the nearby town, through quiet observations about how often travelers pass through the area, how rare it had become to find untouched lakefront property, how the man had shifted in ways she had never paid attention to before. And it was during one of those casual conversations, nothing planned, nothing strategic, that someone mentioned how cabins like hers were being rented out months in advance, how people were willing to pay for exactly the kind of space she had sitting there and used for years. And at first, she dismissed it, not because it didn't make sense, but because she wasn't used to thinking of anything she owned as valuable anymore. But the idea stayed with her, lingering in the background as she continued working. And eventually, curiosity turned into research, and research turned into planning. And before she fully realized it, Laura had begun transforming the cabin, not just into something livable, but into something intentional, something that could serve a purpose beyond memory. And it wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where the scale of starting over felt overwhelming, moments where she questioned whether she was capable of building something on her own after spending so many years believing everything had to be shared to matter. But each time those thoughts surfaced, she pushed through them, not with blind confidence, but with quiet persistence, focusing on what she could control. One decision at a time, one improvement at a time, and slowly, almost without noticing the exact moment it changed. The cabin stopped feeling like a remnant of the past and started becoming the foundation of something new. And when she finally listed for short-term stays, she didn't expect much, maybe a few bookings, enough to cover basic expenses. But what happened instead surprised her because the response was immediate, consistent, and stronger than anything she had prepared for. And within months, the income it generated wasn't just helpful, it was transformative. Not because it made her wealthy overnight, but because it gave her something far more important: independence. The kind she hadn't truly had in decades. The kind that didn't rely on anyone else's decisions or permissions or hidden strategies. And as that independence grew, so did her confidence. Not in a loud or obvious way, but in the quiet certainty of knowing she was capable of building something on her own terms. And that certainty began to extend beyond the cabin itself, leading her to explore other opportunities, other properties, other ways to expand what she had started. And within a few years, what began as a forgotten piece of land had turned into something sustainable, something stable, something entirely hers. And it was around that time that she heard through mutual acquaintances and fragmented conversations that Daniel's situation wasn't as secure as it once appeared, that the business he had fought so hard to keep was struggling under pressures he hadn't anticipated, that investments he had counted on weren't delivering the results he expected. And while Laura didn't take satisfaction in those details, she couldn't ignore the contrast between where they had both ended up. Because a man who had once controlled every aspect of their shared life was now navigating uncertainty in a way he had never planned for. And the woman he had left with almost nothing was standing on something solid he had never even seen. And when they eventually crossed paths again, unexpectedly, at a gathering neither of them had anticipated attending, the moment wasn't dramatic or confrontational. It was quiet, almost ordinary. But there was something in the way he looked at her that made it clear he didn't understand what he was seeing, because she didn't look like someone who had lost everything. She didn't carry the weight he expected her to carry. And when he asked carefully how she was doing, the question wasn't casual. It was searching, as if he was trying to reconcile the outcome he had engineered with the reality standing in front of him. And Laura didn't offer a long explanation or any details about what she had built. She simply answered honestly, "I'm doing well." And there was something in the simplicity of that response that said more than any explanation could have, because it wasn't just about financial stability or success. It was about something deeper, something he had never accounted for. And the conversation ended, and they went their separate ways. Daniel was left with a realization he couldn't fully process, that despite everything he had done to secure every advantage, despite every account he had taken and every asset he had claimed, there had been one thing outside his reach, one thing he had overlooked completely. And that single oversight had become the starting point for everything Laura built after he was gone. And in the end, it wasn't the loss of what he took that defined her story. It was what he forgot, the one piece of her life that remained untouched, the one place that gave her space to rebuild, and the one decision he didn't even know he had made, to leave that cabin out of his plan, that ensured he never truly took everything from her.